Hello there everybody and welcome to the Mr. Sinn channel. In this video we'll be looking at supply. Today we're going to be exploring different ways supply can change, the law of supply, and also different types of supply. So sit back, take out those guided notes, you can find them in the description below as we explore the wonderful world of supply. Now, one of the first things that we have to go into is the law of supply. And this is really important to understand. If you haven't watched my other video on demand, by the way, make sure you check that out. The law of supply is different than the law of demand, but both are vital for you to understand if you're going to be able to put the two together. For us to put the two together, supply and demand, you have to understand them separately. So if you haven't seen that video yet, click on the card on the top right and go check that video out. But the law of supply is this. As our price goes up, the amount that a company or a producer will supply will also go up. It makes sense. If you can sell something for more, you're more likely to sell more of it. If I could sell something for $50 instead of $10, I'm probably more willing to do whatever I can to continue to sell more at that $50 rate. Well, while at 10, I still might want to sell some, but I'm not going to go out of my way to make sure that I can produce the maximum amount. So the price and quantity supplied will both go up together and both go down together. Companies are motivated by profit and trying to make the most money possible. So when they can charge more for certain products, they're more willing to approve things like overtime or do extra hours to be able to get stuff, or maybe even make more factories to produce more of a supply. There's a bunch of different things that can change. And that's going to be the next part of this video, is we're going to look at how does supply change, because there's different things that will impact supply than demand. So let's go now and figure out all the different ways that our supply can change based on market events. One of the first two things that can change a supply is actually the government and regulations and also our input costs. When the government puts more regulations on companies, that normally makes it so it's going to cost them more to be able to produce things. That increases then their input costs. Input costs are things that go into making a final product. So if I'm making t-shirts and all of a sudden cotton goes up in price, my input costs just got more expensive. That means I'm more likely to maybe produce less, unless I can all of a sudden start charging more in the market, so I keep my higher profit margins. When the government regulates or when we see our input costs go up, traditionally we see supply start to decrease because it's not as profitable to be in this industry or to make this typical good. Now, on the other hand, if government regulations get pulled back or if our input costs go down, we'll see the quantity supplied start to increase. This is because now we can make actually more money, and so we have more incentive to produce more. The next two things is going to be technology and productivity. Now, these two also kind of go hand in hand. With technology, as we see more advancements, we see more opportunities for producers to lower their costs and to also be able to produce things more efficiently. Ever since the Industrial Revolution, we've been able to mass produce. This has made it possible for us to make large amounts of quantities of different goods and services so that we can actually sell more at a cheaper cost to the producer. This encourages then more growth. Now with productivity, with just new technological advancements, we have more productivity, but there's other things that could impact that as well. If let's say all of a sudden we're coming up to the holiday season, one of the things for some of the jobs that I've had in my career is I worked at the Mall of America. When working there, when we knew that it was going to become busy, we would approve overtime. This would then increase the amount of workers we would have because we knew that the demand would be up. Now, this is starting to combine supply and demand a little bit, but when productivity is needed, companies can come up with incentive programs to try and motivate their employees to produce more for them. Whether it be the example I gave at the Mall of America, where while we're not necessarily producing a good at the theme park, at least in the center of it, we are providing a service. And when we have more people, we need to provide more of that service. So we need more ride operators, more custodians, more food workers, more guest service representatives to be able to work. So we find ways to incentivize our employees to come in. For other companies, they'll just provide bonuses if you sell a certain amount, or if you are able to produce this amount, you'll get a check or something like that. It's just important to understand that incentives are key, and it's a great way to motivate employees to be able to produce more, making your productivity more. That will then in turn increase your supply. So the next two things that can change our supply are taxes and subsidies. Taxes can actually decrease our supply if they are increased on companies. That's because it's raising their input costs. It's becoming more expensive to produce things. If taxes become too high, the companies might actually stop producing that item altogether and move into a different market. Subsidies, on the other hand, have the opposite effect. A subsidy is when the government is actually going to give money to a company to produce something. So for example, in the United States, for a very long time, the government subsidized corn. We intentionally overproduced corn because the government gave farmers money for producing. So that lowered our costs for producing that product. That kind of artificially changed the market a little bit. So then farmers were more willing to produce more corn because they got this money. So that can increase a supply. The next one then is a change in expectations. Now this is really important. If producers think that the price is going to go up in the future, they might hold off on their supply. We can look at the oil market as a perfect example of this. When prices get really low, what starts to happen is producers stop selling as much oil onto the market. They'll actually hold it. They might be drilling and continuing that, but they're not going to release it to everyone because they'll wait for the money to go back up, meaning money being the price of gas and oil, and then they'll release their items because they want to sell it at the highest price. If they think right now the market's too low, they're going to start possibly stockpiling. And then when the prices go back up, then they would release the supply. So supply can be changed just on expectations of what's going to happen to the price of that particular item. And it's kind of interesting because that has a lot of kind of mind games of going on of trying to predict what will happen in the future to determine your current actions. Our last change is the number of sellers. Now this one's going to seem a little bit weird because there's a couple different things that can happen. If we have too many people in a market, it can actually decrease our supply. Now, why would that be? If we have too many people producing, what's going to happen? Well, we're going to have a lot of quantity out there. So prices will have to come down. And when prices start to come down, then people will start to leave the market and they'll start decreasing their quantity supplied. So too much competition can actually be a bad thing. On the other hand, if we have no competition, that can also be an issue as well, because then a monopoly would form. And if you need more information on monopolies, check out my video on monopolies. But when that happens, we start to see then supply get shifted again. And the reason why is because then they don't have to worry about competition. So they can control the price. So really, when there's too much competition, the number of sellers does impact the amount supplied. It can be great to have more people producing a product, but if we have too much competition, we're going to see a decrease as people will have to opt out of the market, as prices will start to go down. Then the law of supply is in effect, and as prices fall, so does the supply. Hopefully these changes kind of make sense. Last thing we're going to go over real quick is elasticity. We talked about this in demand, but these are different types of supply. And it's important to understand what's happening here because there's different reasons why something would be an elastic product and an inelastic when talking about supply instead of demand, which we've already covered. Now, just like demand, there's different types of supply. One type of supply is elastic supply. Now, unlike demand, supply changes because of time. The producer's ability to be able to produce more. Now, the faster they can change their quantity supplied, the more elastic it is. The slower it takes, the more inelastic it is. Just think of it this way. Elastic, just like demand, is going to be big moves. So if I can quickly increase my supply, it's going to be an elastic supply. However, if let's say all of a sudden my demand doubles and now all of a sudden I have to produce all of this stuff, but I can't change my output for maybe another 2 months, we're more inelastic. The slower it'll take for me to be able to increase or decrease my supply, the more inelastic it is. If it's ever proportional, so let's say all of a sudden demand, our price is going up by 5%, demand's going down a little bit, but all of a sudden since our price goes up, I want to sell more because of the law of supply, so I'm going to increase the same percentage, then it's going to be a unit elastic. Again, just all that means whenever we're seeing the exact same thing happen between price and also our quantity, it's going to be unit. When we see elastic, we have big moves, so I can quickly increase. So let's look at a hypothetical. Let's say I'm working at a coffee shop, and all of a sudden we have a line out the door. It's stretching around the block. I have thousands of people waiting to get a cup of coffee. The coffee shop can easily produce more coffee. If they realize this is going on, they can quickly call more people in. They can start producing more coffee just by having more employees. They could try to go to another store and buy more coffee pots. Wouldn't maybe be the most ideal situation, but they could do that. They could pull people from the register and start making more of an assembly line inside the shop to be able to quickly get coffee out. Or batching all the coffee, asking who wants just plain coffee, making 15 of those at a time, and then going on to the next order. That way they can serve more people quicker. That would be an example of elastic. If they needed to, they could quickly produce more coffee. Or if, let's say, sales are really slow, well, they could just send employees home and decrease their output. All they would have to do is say, all right, we don't need anyone right now, who wants to go home? And people would be sent home, and that would decrease their supply. On the other hand, if we look at like a phone producer, let's say Apple, if all of a sudden the demand for iPhones shoots through the roof and they are short a million phones, they can't just all of a sudden make 1 million phones in the blink of an eye. They would have to open more factories, hire more workers, get more resources to produce those phones. Those things take time. That would be a perfect example of an inelastic supply. Hopefully this is making sense between elastic and inelastic in supply, and also just the law of supply, how all this stuff impacts the world we live in today. I'm Mr. Sinn. Thanks for stopping by. I hope this video helped. Don't forget to subscribe and check out some of the other videos on the channel. Until next time, I'll see you online.